Hello and welcome to the Flourishing Introvert Talks with me, Jo Rawbone. This is the podcast that celebrates the natural gifts of introverts so that we can flourish in all situations. Episode 229. Motivation. What lights you up? So many of my course delegates want to know how to motivate their team members. I have a simple answer which doesn't always go down too well. My answer? It's not your responsibility to motivate other people. But be warned, you can demotivate people very easily. It seems massively unfair somehow, doesn't it? If I can do all I can to lift people, but it'll probably make no difference, but do one thing wrong and I've lost them. This quote from Stephen Covey is writ large on my mind and comes to the fore every time the motivation question is asked of me. His quote, "Motivation is a fire from within. If somebody else tries to light that fire under you, chances are it will burn very briefly." This points to two different types of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic motivation is usually considered the most powerful because it's when we do something because we find it gratifying in some way. We don't need external rewards to tempt or incentivize us. We do it for personal reasons, and that is reason enough. It's recognised that high intrinsic motivation is a strong predictor of performance. So those with this type of motivation are the type of people I want on my team, because their motivation will keep them going long after my encouragement or the initial buzz has gone. The other type of motivation is extrinsic, and whilst also useful, it's risky to rely on it because typically it's only good for a short-term kind of jump start, really. Extrinsic behaviour is driven by some kind of external reward, but the moment the reward is devalued in some way, the motivation reduces too. What's so interesting from an introvert's perspective is that research by Colin DeYoung, a psychology professor at the University of Minnesota, seems to show that introverts are, and I quote, less engaged, motivated and energised by the possibilities for reward that surround them. He also notes that extroverts appear to have a more active dopamine reward system than introverts, and we've talked about that before with the Christine Fonseca research. De Jong goes on to say that extroverts' brains become more active at the prospect of a possible reward, which they pursue thanks to the dopamine hit. And our brains, as introverts, tend to prefer acetylcholine, the power-down chemical for the feel-good factor, so rewards may not energise us in the same way. In the same vein, Susan Cain, in her book Quiet, a Bible surely for all introverts, also says that introverts tend to be much less motivated by external goals, especially if they feel that they're arbitrary or lack real meaning. So potentially, and I do mean potentially, extrinsic motivation is less likely to float our boat. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so maybe I'll do a poll about it sometime soon. Now, if we can't motivate people successfully, what can we do? This brings us to the next important point about motivation. We have to take time to understand what motivates us, and I can tell you from experience this is rarely easy. And it's for this reason that this forms part of the early work of the Frustrated to Flourishing programme, as most of my clients have needed support with this. Once we know what really motivates us, it makes sense to share our findings with our leaders, managers and partners as appropriate. Question though, have you ever been asked this by your line or people manager? Most of the leaders who work with me know how to do this now, and it's already making a difference. And it has to start with us. We're the role models here. So if we're not able to motivate others, now we know what motivates them. Our responsibility is to put the conditions in place so that people can access their intrinsic motivation and therefore be self-motivated. As you might imagine, this process takes some time, especially if no one has ever asked them and they've not really thought about it before. What I love about this approach is that it encourages self-empowerment and tends to prevent unhealthy dependency on the manager or leader. And there's no avoiding this, but this approach scares the micromanager, the control freak types. And when it comes to goals, using aggressive adjectives like crushing, smashing, slaying are highly unlikely to fire me up. They might work for some, but not for me. I am results oriented to a point, but I have a stronger need for affiliation, to use McClelland's terms. I'm also conflict averse, so I find the language and therefore the intention completely inappropriate. One of the big mistakes people make is to assume that we're all motivated in the same way. And of course, the one thing that people mention first is money. The question I ask is, if I give you an extra 3,000, in my case pounds or dollars or whatever it happens to be, how much harder will you work for me? How much more enthusiastic and engaged will you be? The honest answer from most is, well, maybe for a really short while, but I think I deserve it anyway. I take this as crude proof that incentives at best provide a short-term boost. In his brilliant RSA short animated video, Daniel Pink makes the powerful point that we have to pay people enough to take money off the table. Then we can start talking about motivation. I'll come back to Dan Pink later, as he makes so much sense on this subject. So what is motivation anyway? We rather bandy the term around like it's a known, and yet I'm not sure how well understood it really is. I rather like Baumeister's way of looking at it. In 2016, he said it all boils down to wanting. Motivation is an internal subconscious process that spurs us into action in order to get something we want. These wants and needs typically relate to sustaining or improving life in some way. So we can evaluate or measure our motivation by our actions. Fewer actions equals lower motivation, no matter how motivated I might say I am. So a key question here is, what energises me so I take action? I know what motivates me. It's the sense of lived inequity that most introverted employees face, and at all levels. Many C-suite execs tell me how they got to where they are by pretending to be more extroverted. And just like me, it took its toll. That's the why behind what I do, and it clearly paves the way for the legacy I want to leave in people. And I'm in this for the long haul, so I definitely need that intrinsic motivation. I said I'd come back to Dan Pink, and that point has arrived. Pink's own research shows that there are 3 components to intrinsic motivation: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. I'll start with autonomy, as there is so much recent research that puts this higher than anything else when it comes to motivation. So autonomy is the desire to direct our own lives and to take control of more, like having control over our work and how we do it. Controversially, this aligns with agile working and rethinking traditional rules about the workplace, which many CEOs and leaders are now railing against. When people are given the freedom to choose their tasks, the methods, and their team members, they are more engaged and productive. I still remember the brilliant video I watched about Ricardo Semler and the way he set up his organisation. That was back in the 1980s, and it's no wonder that he was called a maverick. But still, very few are not brave enough to allow that level of autonomy. The second of Pink's components is mastery. This meets our human predisposition to learn, grow and develop, the urge to get better and better at something that matters. If mastery forms part of your motivation, you'll believe your potential is unlimited, meaning you'll probably be a happy, lifelong learner with a growth mindset. Mastery involves a mindset of continuous improvement and practice. People are motivated when they're working on tasks that are challenging but achievable, allowing them to experience and celebrate progress and growth. The third component is purpose. You'll have heard me talk before about the importance of purpose and the usefulness of the westernized version of Ikigai for flushing out your purpose. This is about the desire to do what we do in service of something larger than ourselves. Having a clear sense of purpose helps individuals see the value in their work and feel connected to a greater cause. This alignment with a higher purpose can significantly enhance motivation, satisfaction, and therefore fulfillment. I'm staggered by how many employees don't know or understand the purpose of their organisation other than to make money for the owners or shareholders. And we wonder why motivation and engagement are lacking. I have shared for many years that part of a manager's responsibility is to enable their team members to see the picture on the jigsaw box lid. You see, we're all like jigsaw pieces, interacting with those immediately around us. But how does what we do complete the overall picture? So motivation is so much more than reward and punishment, carrot and stick. When we're beyond survival, and I know that some are struggling with that right now, we need to think differently about our own motivation and the motivation of those around us. Where can we let go and give people more of the control they crave? And as introverts, how do we access and communicate what motivates us, knowing that we'll probably experience some pushback? On a side note, I share my learnings and often what motivates me with my audience in my weekly reflections email. Many people write back saying that they find my reflections very helpful, including what in particular resonated with them and, more importantly, what they're going to do as a result. You'll find the link to receive my weekly emails in the episode description. Now, back to accessing and communicating what motivates us. The answer is that by being so clear that the bravery required to communicate the autonomy you need, the mastery you're working towards, and if appropriate, your purpose is easily accessible. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, then please subscribe, rate us and leave a comment, because we know that that helps other people find the podcast. And if other people find us, other introverts can flourish.
You are listening to an Intentional Media Production podcast.